Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Titanfall 2 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Titanfall. It was developed by Respawn Entertainment and published by Electronic Arts on October 28th of this year, and it's pretty much a case of EA sending it out to die. It was released pretty shortly after Battlefield 1. It was about 7 days afterwards, in fact. And it was not much longer until Call of Duty Infinite Warfare was released. So you have the situation where the game was just released between two absolute titans of the genre, and you have the issue of it not really being advertised all that strongly. EA seemed to think that the people who would be playing Battlefield 1 wouldn't be the same people who would be playing Titanfall 2, and they were horribly wrong about that. Launch sales were rather disappointing for EA, and who can blame it? The game was released between two absolutely gigantic games as far as advertising and hype goes, so it really didn't matter how good Titanfall 2 was. It mattered more, hey, you released it between these two other games that are both at $60 a pop, so people just had to make a decision there, and they decided not to go with Titanfall 2 based on thoughts from the beta, which was admittedly a bit messy, and also thoughts from the original Titanfall, whether or not it would be worth it in the long run. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out what they changed up from the original game and whether or not it's actually worth getting. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's definitely a step up over the original Titanfall, and it actually still runs on the Source engine, if you can believe that. I know it's hard to believe, but it actually does run on the Source engine. You wouldn't think that by looking at it because it looks absolutely nothing like any of Valve's games, but it goes to show you that the engine is more versatile than we thought. The environment art in particular is absolutely fantastic. They did a great job of making it really pop out. But even the stuff that isn't related to the environment art is all very well done, except for the lip sync, which is something I would describe as subpar. It's not the worst I've ever seen or anything like that, but it's definitely quite a bit behind modern releases like, say, Battlefield 1, and it's more in line with stuff that came out around the 2008 or 2009 era. But they kind of make up for this with all of the other animations, which are very smooth, very fluid, they flow together extremely well, and in particular with the case of BT, you get a surprising amount of, oddly enough, emotion for a robot. There's just lots of finer details that you wouldn't necessarily notice unless you were paying attention to it that really do make him come across as a lot more evocative than what you would expect for a robot, let alone something that is meant to be piloted. That said, the visuals are not without their faults. The texture quality is not the greatest around. It's certainly not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it could definitely be better. And there's also the issue of the characters looking kind of plasticky. There's just something off about the shaders that makes some of the characters look like they're made of plastic, and it really is jarring when you go from most of the game looking fine to suddenly you're encountering a character who looks like they're made of plastic. But at least even with the issues with the actual visual quality, this thing looks good, and it runs extremely well. Buttery smooth, 60 plus frames per second all the time, and that is so well appreciated in a game that is as fast-paced and precision-oriented as this can be. Respawn definitely should be commended for releasing a proper PC version with plenty of options and rock-solid performance throughout. Of course, they also deserve praise for one particular element of the sound design that is improved over the previous game, which is the sound effects themselves. While some of the sounds are definitely recycled from the previous game, they're modified somewhat. They're given more bass, more oomph, which means that most of the weapon sounds in this are actually fairly beefy. You fire a particularly powerful weapon and it's gonna sound powerful, and that is something that should definitely be commended considering that apparently most developers can't seem to do that. Where things peter out a bit are in the music and in the voice acting. Now, there's nothing really wrong with the voice acting per se, it's just nothing particularly great. It's solid enough for what they're trying to do with it, but other than that, they don't really impress you all that much. And while main characters are generally voiced fairly well, the normal soldiers can sound a bit bored sometimes. It's not really a deal breaker, nor is the soundtrack, which is definitely a solid enough soundtrack. It's got a sort of sci-fi electronic with orchestral thing going on, but there's nothing really memorable about it. There's no one track you're going to be able to point to and go, yeah, that track, that's from Titanfall 2. They definitely fit the action that's going on and definitely help you to get that sort of action movie vibe, but they definitely don't last outside of the game, and even within the context of the game, you don't really get all that much out of the music. So that's somewhat disappointing, but other than that and the other issues I've already discussed, the presentation is generally rather well done. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Jack Cooper, who starts off as a rifleman until he becomes the acting pilot for BT-7274, who's linked with Cooper's mentor, Captain Ty Lastimosa, and after Lastimosa dies very, very early in the game, I mean this is something you can see coming from a mile away, so that's really not a spoiler. You end up going with BT-7274 in order to complete the mission that the captain had before, which was Special Operation 217. This leads you on a campaign where you're going up against the forces of the Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation, or IMC, and trying to rendezvous with Frontier Militia forces in order to stop them from basically being evil bad guys. The game does not give a fair and balanced portrayal of the IMC, let's put it that way. It does give a bit more nuance to the mercenaries who work for the IMC, like Blisk for example, but the actual IMC are basically seen as nothing more than these kind of evildoers, who are stomping on the people of the frontier purely because they are a corporation, therefore of course they are in it for only money and nothing more, meaning that human life has no value to them. Needless to say, the militia versus IMC thing is grossly oversimplified, and it's really just background noise when you get down to it. What they mean to be the actual meat of the plot is the relationship between Jack and BT, or as Respawn themselves put it, the link between pilots and Titans, because the pilots do have some degree of attachment with their Titans and vice versa. The further you get into the game, the more you realize that the Titans aren't simply heartless machines that just are there to do their pilot's bidding. They actually do have personalities of their own. And generally speaking, they did a rather good job of that with BT. He comes across as actually having some degree of character rather than simply being something trying to have a character. Admittedly, Jack himself has barely any personality whatsoever. You can occasionally make him say a sarcastic comment or make a joke or something along those lines by selecting one of two dialogue options whenever you're prompted for them in the course of the game. But these really don't have all that much bearing on his character, and they don't really have any bearing on what's going on either. They just change a bit of the dialogue and everything else remains the same. The problem with that isn't so much that you don't really have control over Jack's character, it's that he really doesn't have much of a character at all. He's a rather generic first-person shooter avatar more than anything else, and it really does scream a missed opportunity there. They had so many opportunities throughout the course of the campaign to actually make the link between BT and Jack more compelling, simply by giving Jack a proper character, and instead what we get is basically a player avatar interacting with BT, which means it's that much harder to actually get attached to the plot and the characters simply because the only one you're really going to be able to stick with is BT. The thing is that while they did miss quite a few opportunities with the plot itself and the way the characters interact, they definitely nailed the single-player gameplay. It's fast-paced, and it ramps up to a degree where you have this massive climactic showdown, which is only partially resolved. They gotta leave it open for the sequel, obviously, but it's really obvious sequel bait, and that's a bit of a shame. But instead of doing the safe thing, which was to make a generic modern military shooter campaign, they actually took full advantage of the movement system and designed the levels entirely around it, meaning that you have some really clever level design that flows together extremely well. There are plenty of opportunities to be able to go blisteringly fast compared to basically every other modern shooter on the market, and it is incredibly well appreciated because not only does this train you up rather well for the multiplayer, but it fits in perfectly with what they're trying to go for. Titanfall really is all about the dynamic between Titan and pilot gameplay. The pilot is supposed to be very fast, very nimble, and supposed to be able to be very acrobatic, whereas the Titan is more like a modern military shooter in that they stomp around a bit more, they're slower, but they also do more damage. And that is used to full effect throughout the course of the campaign. You have your duels against other pilots and their Titans, you have your running on the ground gameplay where you're mowing down hordes and hordes and hordes of the IMC's grunts. You have lots of platforming segments where you have to just navigate an environment that is either hazardous or otherwise complicated to navigate, and the movement system works extremely well with it. And a brief spoiler here, so I'll put up a little warning there for those of you who give a crap about this. But one particular level actually has you able to switch back and forth between two timelines in the same area. It is a really cool mechanic, and when you actually start navigating through that level and you get used to how that time-switching mechanic works, it actually ends up being one of the most interesting parts of the entire game. And quite honestly, I'm not sure if I've ever seen anything quite like it in a video game before. I have seen various elements of timeline switching brought into various games, but I don't know if I've ever had anything that is that fast-paced and that on the fly. And like I said, it ends up being one of the best parts of the game, so that really does work out very well for it in the long run. And as far as the Titan gameplay goes, it depends pretty much entirely on what loadout you've got for BT, which actually can be switched on the fly. Meaning the game gives you ample opportunity to try out different loadouts that you'll eventually be using in the multiplayer and see how they work and what works well for you, as well as adapt to meet the situation at hand. Sometimes it'd be better for the Legion loadout, or sometimes it'd be better for the Tone loadout, it just depends. And this is all packaged together in a campaign that would be fantastic except for one really nasty problem other than what I've already mentioned. It's a really short campaign, as in it might be 4 hours if you play it on the hardest setting. This makes the missed opportunity bit that I said before even more painful, because you can see bits and pieces here and there where they definitely could have expanded the campaign and made it more compelling in the long run, as well as make it feel like you really got your bang for your buck with the campaign. But instead we get a campaign that leaves you wanting more and leaving this thing open for yet another sequel, which is fine, I guess, but it does feel like there's a lot of missed potential here. And the multiplayer doesn't really help to assuage that particular issue, simply because it's just not the same as the single player. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The multiplayer isn't really intended to be the single player, only in multiplayer format. So what did they actually do with the multiplayer this time around to differentiate it from the original game and perhaps improve upon things? Well, for starters, they actually listened to the feedback both from the original Titanfall as well as with the beta. The first thing you'll notice if you've played the original Titanfall is that there's quite a lot more content this time around, and they actually differentiate the classes a bit better too. You have a core ability that each pilot class is centered around, like, say, cloaking or being able to grapple on things. You get a grappling hook that you can swing around with, that sort of thing. But you also get, of course, your weapon slots and the attachment and sight slots for all of those, as well as the ability to select different types of grenades that you can throw, which can be things like, of course, frag grenades or shot grenades, or even actually a shuriken that lights things on fire. The weapons are a bit more varied than they were in the original Titanfall, where most things were determined more from stat differences than from how the actual weapons function. In this one, however, you get a sniper rifle that's double barrel and fires both barrels at once. You've got an submachine gun that's also double barreled, so it does massive damage but burns through ammo like crazy. You've got quite a few energy weapons this time around, most of which are actually projectile based rather than hit scan, so that's pretty cool. And you've got an awful lot of skins available, whether that be for your weapons or for your character themselves. You can have different camouflages on your character in addition to the camouflages on your weapons. The problems with that start to come in when it comes to actually unlocking them, which is done entirely through a sort of challenge system, where you have these various tasks that you need to complete in order to get that particular skin. Now for some of these, they're pretty easy, like land so many shots on enemy titans or something along those lines, but for others, they take absolutely forever, like travel 2,500 kilometers on foot. Something like that is just downright ridiculous, and it also doesn't help that a lot of your unlocks are sort of locked behind levels, but not really. They unlock automatically once you reach a certain level. There's also an in-game currency that you earn by playing that will allow you to unlock things early. Now, I wish it was more in that direction than in the level unlock system, although the thing is that the weapons you start with and the gear you start with are usually rather good. It's more a matter of later on you start to unlock things that are a bit more specialized and a bit harder to use, so they become a bit more interesting once you're at that level, but at no point do you run into the problem of not being remotely competitive with the other players. And if you learn the maps and you learn how to move and you learn how to aim and shoot, then you should be fine throughout the vast majority of the game. Where things get a bit messier is in regards to the Titans, where the Legion Titan is a bit overpowered in the sense that it can take a ridiculous amount of punishment, and if you don't have your entire team attacking one at once, then there's a pretty good chance that it's just not going to go down. There's also the issue of the capture the flag mode in particular being downright horrible. Every single time you're going to have one team just dominating the entire match, and they're just going to end up calling in all of their Titans on the enemy base and just sit there and camp the base until they eventually win. It is frustrating as hell, and I cannot stand when it comes up in the mixtape mode, which is your basic variety playlist. Similarly, the new bounty hunt mode, while a pretty decent idea on paper, where both teams are competing over money which is earned by actually defeating various marked NPCs on the map, and it's ruined almost exclusively by the idea that you can actually steal the funds that the various players have already earned simply by killing them and then just running off and depositing it into your own bank. Because if you manage to die while you've still got a bonus going on, then you're going to lose half of that bonus to the other player that killed you, and then you have to deal with the fact that the person who killed you is going to run off with their own bank and deposit that money, so you can't do a thing about it. And whenever an opponent carries that bonus that they stole from you right over to their own bank and then deposit it, it's basically like a punch in the gut. And like with the capture the flag mode, I've only seen the bounty hunt mode get close once. More often than not, it ends up being a matter where one team just completely curb stomps the other one. You don't have as much of an issue with that in the main mode that's meant to be played with Titanfall, which is the attrition mode, where you have all the minions running around. And you also don't run into it as much with the pilots versus pilots mode. Where you do also run into it is in the last Titan standing mode, where one team is just going to laughably curb stomp the other one pretty much no matter what happens. But really the attrition mode is where it's at. You've got all these various grunts and specters and such running around the map, and as you keep destroying them, not only does that help your team out, but it also makes you get closer and closer to getting your Titan, which is always nice. This means that the best Titanfall players are going to be the ones who are actually playing the objective and playing it well. And not everybody has figured that out yet, it seems. There's quite a few people who are obviously from the Call of Duty crowd because they'll just run in guns blazing no matter what it is. The thing is, while you can kind of get away with doing that as a pilot, you really can't do it as a Titan because Titan health doesn't regenerate, so you need to pay more attention to what's going on with that and make sure you can get batteries in order to replenish your Titan's health. And that's the case both in single and multiplayer, but it's more prominent in the multiplayer because you actually have to get out of your Titan, go grab a battery, bring it back, and then insert it into the Titan to be able to get any benefit out of it. In the single player, you can just run over the batteries with your Titan and you'll end up collecting them, so it's not really much of a problem there. The thing is, that's a lot harder to do that in the multiplayer because you actually have to pull the battery out of another Titan before you're able to put it in your own Titan. And every single Titan is equipped with electric smoke to be able to defeat rodeo attacks where you hop on the back of the Titan and pull the battery out or toss grenades into the exposed battery hull. Whenever you're doing that, you are very, very vulnerable, so either you're vulnerable to the electric smoke or you're vulnerable to somebody on the enemy team picking you off because they spot you while you're on a buddy of theirs back. In fact, your options against Titans as a pilot are pretty underwhelming this time around. The anti-Titan weapons really aren't all that effective, and the ones that actually are effective aren't really unlocked until much later in the progression than what you would hope for. Meaning that generally whenever you see a Titan, the thing to do is to just let another Titan attack it or attack it with your own Titan, because trying to do a rodeo attack or trying to use one of the anti-Titan weapons really isn't going to work very well. But other than a few balancing issues like that, the map design is rather solid for what's going on here, and it takes full advantage of the movement system. You've got the dynamic between the Titans and the pilots, which was of course interesting in the first game and has only been improved since then. You have solid netcode that works very well for the most part, although I have had a few weird issues with frame rate hitching due to packet loss and things like that, but that's something that's more related to my internet connection than it is to the game. So that might have just been an isolated incident there. But other than that, what you've got here is basically the game that the original Titanfall should have been. It is a fantastic starting off point for the series if you haven't played it already, and the multiplayer is full-featured enough to actually keep you coming back to it. There's always something for you to unlock, there's different modes you can try, there's the idea of the networks where you can actually create a network and then have all these different people join it, and thus you make it easier to find games with people you might be interested in playing the games with. Or at the very least, that's the idea. It's supposed to bring the community together, and it seems to do a decent enough job with it as long as you're part of a large group. But things get a bit messier if you're with a smaller group. And then of course there's the issue of the multiplayer having matchmaking only. There is no server browser here, it's just matchmaking, even though it does appear to run on dedicated servers. So that's definitely something they could either improve later on by simply adding in a server browser, or they could put a server browser into subsequent games, or whatever the solution might actually be to simply having matchmaking. Because the matchmaking just generally finds you a bunch of players and throws you into a match, and it doesn't really give too much of a crap what the skill levels of the players are or anything of that nature. So more often than not, you'll end up with a group of people who have no idea what they're doing, and you'll just get your asses handed to you. But here's the thing, none of these issues are really deal breakers. They're problematic enough to be noticeable and be annoying when they do come up, but generally speaking, you're going to be able to have a very good time with Titanfall 2 if you like fast-paced shooters. And if you played the original Titanfall and you found it a bit lacking but otherwise enjoyed it, then you might want to take a look at Titanfall 2 because it addresses pretty much everything that the original Titanfall did wrong and mostly improves upon things. Even lesser things like not running out of ammo when you're in the multiplayer is just enough to make the gameplay flow a lot better, and it just ends up being an incredibly enjoyable game as a result. Now, without its problems, of course, it's definitely not anywhere near perfect, but again, this is the game that the original Titanfall should have been. A very strong entry for the series, and really, this is where the series should just be picking up and moving on from here. Because while the original Titanfall was good, this one's great. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.